And without further ado, I would like to introduce Chicago's favorite son, David Heinemeier Hansson.
Morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about legacy software today. And I think that's actually, it's a good time to do so because it's been almost exactly 5 years since I started working on Ruby on Rails. Started to do my first Ruby, actually. And 5 years, I think, is actually an eternity in most software circles. And it's definitely been an eternity for me, and it's been an opportunity to watch some software grow and to reflect on that growth. But before we get into that, let's try to go back a little bit. Let's try to remember everybody the first time you discovered Ruby on Rails. Because I think going back to that feeling is really pivotal to understanding the notion of legacy software as it relates to Rails and to many other things. Because I think most people, when they first encountered Ruby on Rails, they got all excited, not just for the Ruby on Rails stuff, but they got excited because they were probably working on an application already. And that application perhaps wasn't what they thought they would like to be working on, or the aspects of it were feeling a little stale, a little old, and the excitement for Ruby on Rails, I think, in many ways was an excitement to kind of clean the slate, try something new, get out of that legacy application that they were working on, either by having an opportunity to rewrite it, to replace some of the aspects of it, or to start something new entirely. And I think that feeling is really interesting to examine a little bit closer. I think the reason why people got excited about Ruby on Rails and was interested in giving something new a try was really less about Ruby on Rails itself, and more because their application probably looked something like this. It was kind of a mess. And I would know that because my applications were kind of a mess. The stuff that I was working on were not the best I thought I could do. So to get an opportunity to try something new, an entirely new platform, kind of was that promise that we could clean this mess up, that we could fit all the cables really neatly together as though we thought we should be doing, that we could clean the slate squeaky clean, that we could finally get organized. And I think that's really a noble thought. I think it's great to have aspirations that you want to clean your stuff up, but I think it kind of got messed up a little bit along the way. The notion that your legacy application was going to be basically saved by Ruby on Rails is not really a notion I think is helpful. Ruby on Rails in itself is no salvation for legacy applications. It's not supposed to be in itself a way for you to rid you of your wicked ways, because I don't think it works like that. I don't think technology or Ruby on Rails or anything else really can do much more than set you on a path to start you off with something. And if it's not really about Ruby on Rails, then it's about you. And I think that this notion of the salvation that Ruby on Rails was going to bring is basically just wrong. And I think it's very unhelpful to think of it like that, even though at the same time it's, of course, flattering and interesting to see people get really excited. Now it's my chance has come to clean up all the crappy code I've been writing before. I think it's not very helpful because legacy is not a specific technology. The notion of legacy software, working on something that's not fulfilling everything you want to do, it's not about facts. Legacy is not an attribute like this source code is 5 years old, that's an attribute, that's a fact. Legacy is an opinion, and it's an opinion from you about a given code base, about whatever you're working on right now. And I think that sometimes these two things get confused. People ascribe legacy as though it was an attribute to certain things. Well, my old PHP application is legacy, or PHP itself is legacy, or Java is legacy. Well, that one might be right, but that's besides the point. Legacy is really not about a specific technology. What I think legacy is actually about, or can be described as, is it's a function. Legacy is a function of you over time. You change. Technology doesn't really change that much or that rapidly. You change. So your perception of what you consider to be legacy, or how legacy you think something is really about you. And it's about your own evolvement of your taste, your preferences, and your knowledge. And I think that's really important to take hold of, because it means, first of all, legacy is not the same thing for the same kind of people. For some people working on a given application, that might be awesome application, and for somebody else in a different position, it might feel really legacy. And we use this word legacy to kind of describe things in the past that we don't like. And I think that that's more an accurate description and more honest description, really, of how we feel. It's just about old stuff we don't like. Legacy makes it sound as though it is just this fact, that it is this thing we can all agree on. And I don't think that's true. I think most people who write legacy applications thought it was pretty damn great when they wrote it. But at the very same time, even when somebody just wrote a new application in their newest Spring Hibernate setup, somebody else might think they're already writing a legacy application before they're even done. So legacy code is often written by people who thought they had it nailed. They had a really good implementation of what they were working on. And sometimes they'll themselves change that perspective over time, and they'll start to consider that application to be legacy. Not because the application itself really changes, because that's the interesting thing. Most of the time, our perception of what is legacy doesn't require any change to the code base itself. It just requires changes to us. So we can look at the very same piece of code and think, thumbs up, pretty damn great. Look at the very same piece of code a year and a half later, 6 months later, 3 months later, and think, oh my God, what the hell was I thinking? This is terrible. This is legacy. It feels old. It feels stale. So one way of looking at it is this notion of looking at legacy over time. And I've done some research here and inspected my own feelings on legacy and over time, and come up with this very precise diagram to reflect how that works. As we were talking about, when you first start out writing a new application, usually you think it's pretty great. Otherwise, you wouldn't be writing it like that most of the time. So we start from a position of best code ever. I mean, you can see it's actually already a little bit up the legacy scale, because even when we're writing it, there's usually always something that we think, we could have done that a little bit better, but I mean, this is pretty damn good. But as time goes on and we learn more stuff, we kind of get to a position where, yeah, this is still pretty good. I mean, I feel good about my code base. I feel good about the health of the system. But, I mean, there's these few things that kind of could be better. I just read this article last week about this technique or that technique, and we could really improve a few things here. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how it's going. Well, that feeling doesn't last for that long. Time goes on, and that feeling of this could be better turns into, this sucks. This is really, ugh. There's just something yucky about this piece of code now. I read another 3 articles, and they all taught me different things about how systems are supposed to be built. So now I again changed my perception of what is best code ever. Again, the code didn't really change. You thought this was best code ever 6 months ago, but your perceptions changed. So as time goes on, this goes from just being, well, this sucks, to I can't take it anymore. I'm working in this legacy environment, and it's constraining my creativity. I'm being captured, I'm being held down by the evil code base. And I think this is really where it becomes very interesting, because legacy software evokes all these emotions in us about being enslaved. The legacy is kind of this prison that we're in. We're forced to work with this terrible code base that we probably wrote ourselves. So we wrote our own prison, but that doesn't really matter. That's still how we feel about it. And if this just gets to go on, if you don't stop to reflect on what's actually going on, how your perceptions of this is going to change, it leads to one final battle cry when you finally had enough time passed by. Your perception of legacy grew to a point where you got to rewrite it. There's nothing we can do now. We got to do a prison break. We got to get out of this jail. And I think that's really a lot about how we think about this. This is not real. None of this is real. The code didn't change. The code is what's real. Our perceptions of it are really up to us. So you get to choose how you feel about your code base, and more importantly, how you react to it. How you react to the changes in you, and how you feel about that code. So the common perception, the common approach to feeling something is legacy is kind of treating it as rotten tomatoes. That this code base used to be this beautiful, luscious tomato, and then just over time, it rotted. And that's depressing. I mean, you're working with a rotten tomato. And again, that's that notion that somehow there's decay. We use all of these words about software as though it was a physical, biological entity that decayed over time, but it doesn't. The software doesn't change. It doesn't automatically rewrite itself. There is no inherent entropy going on. There's no inherent degradable biological process tearing down our code and making it worse. No, the code is always the same. It's our perceptions about it that change. So, if it's our perceptions and we get to choose, why would you choose to have this be a negative thing? Why does it have to be that legacy software is about a rotten tomato? Why does it have to be about the software itself? Why can't it be about you? Why can't it be about the fact that you got smarter? Your neural network got stronger. It got faster. You learned more. When that tomato went from great to rotten, that was a process in you where you improved. That's not something to be sorry for. That's not something to feel sad about. That's something to feel happy about. The fact that you could witness that process in yourself is cause for celebration, not for feeling depressed about what you're working on. And I think that the fact that your neural network is expanding is a reflection of a few things. One, you're learning more, so you're expanding kind of your knowledge sphere. Two, you start appreciating more levels of detail. And I think that's really a lot about what it is to become a better programmer, is to care about details that you didn't even see before. So that's how that tomato that looked perfect before got rotten, because you started noticing all these small things, all these changes, all these details that you didn't care about before, and now you do. So if you've learned to appreciate more smells, more code smells, more elements of good design, and that's all great. So I think for that reason alone, legacy software is not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. It's showing you that you got better, you've grown. And the other thing, too, is that legacy software is inevitable. Whatever you write today will become legacy software. That is a fact. Because there's no way you can create something with what you know today and then go on to be still a programmer and not learn, not grow, not become better, and thus not change your tastes, your perceptions of what constitutes good code. So you pretty much better just come to terms with the fact right now that even the code that you're writing right now is just at the beginning of that curve I showed you before. You are in the best code ever phase right now, but it won't last. And if you don't accept that, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment after disappointment. And that's kind of why I got interested in this subject in the first place. Because I think a lot of people went into Rails thinking, excellent, I found my salvation. I'm never going to write legacy software again. From now on, everything is going to be perfect. And from somebody who's written 5 years' worth of Ruby on Rails software, I can tell you that's not how it works. You will write legacy software in Ruby on Rails. I did, and plenty of it. And it wasn't until I changed my perception of how I feel about legacy software that I started actually appreciating. And not just appreciating that's kind of a nice thing to have. Really thinking of it more as a milestone. When my perceptions changed about the Basecamp source code or code base, I got to the point where I could see that this was great. This was a trophy. The fact that I got handed this perception of legacy software meant that I was now have been so much better, that I could look at the very same code that I thought was best code ever and think that it was crap. That represents a huge leap. And I think that's the perception change that needs to happen for you to be happy as a programmer for more than just the current project that you're on. That legacy software is inevitable, and when it happens, you get to reward yourself. The reward is that you can look at the same thing and feel so much better about it. And I think the people will realize this, or when you realize this, hopefully after this talk, you'll also realize that the best programmers are the one who writes the most legacy software. The best programmers are the ones who learn the most from their projects and go on to be better and better. Thus, the more software you're writing, the more software that you're then looking back at and thinking, this feels stale and old, the better you become. And hopefully this is a process that kind of goes on, which is why I'm pushing back against that notion that once you got to Rails, you were done with legacy software. Because that would mean that once you got to Rails, you were done learning. That would be the stupidest thing ever. You're not done learning just because you change your platform or because you like your tools better. In fact, that should accelerate your learning. Liking your tools, liking what you do, should speed up the process of going from best software ever to biggest ball of mud. But at the same time, that doesn't just mean that it's about producing the most legacy software in the shortest period of time. That's not how it works. You can't just start a ton of projects, leave them, and then look back 3 years from now and say, stupid, legacy software, damn, I'm good. It doesn't just work like that. The product itself is not the legacy software. That's not what you're trying to achieve. It's not crappy software in itself for its own right. It's about you. So I think to be able to watch this transformation, you have to be there. You have to be there, or you don't have to be there, but you get the most out of the process. You get the most out of the transformation. If you're there and actually wrote that software that you thought was best code ever, and you slowly watched it, what you, in your own terms, would think of as decay, into this piece of crap. Because I think when you're watching that process in front of your eyes, you can internalize that change. You can reflect on how and why it's happening. When you're just being faced with a big code base that you feel is legacy, is old, is stale, it's hard to separate the feelings of I'm in a prison from I could extract a whole lot of good information of why is it that I feel this software is crap? What are the exact specific things? Because what I learned is that usually all these feelings comes from very specific ideas, very specific changes in taste. So for example, when I started writing PHP or whatever, I would use camel casing for how I would name things. So when you jump to Ruby, you're using underscores instead of camel casing for method names and so on. That change alone left me with this weird feeling that when I looked at old code that was camel cased, it kind of felt just, It just didn't feel right. The aesthetics weren't right. And that was a very specific thing. It wasn't, like the code base otherwise didn't change. I just changed my idea of what I thought was nice. And if you're there to observe these things, you can separate kind of the different things into different buckets. Some of the things are, I just changed my taste. So I changed how I perceive something to be beautiful. That's very much just an aesthetic thing, and it's very much a debatable thing. But other things are more, I learned a better architecture, I learned a better pattern for attack this kind of problem. That is more like a core knowledge acquisition that you made, where you got better. And that's something to cherish. But you have to separate these things out. And that's why legacy is just this constraining word, because it encapsulates all of this in this world that you can't really use for that much. The other thing, too, is to realize that the better you get, the slower this process is. You don't change as much your perceptions when you've been working with a different or a given platform for 5 years as you do in the beginning. In the beginning, I was changing my perceptions of what was good and bad all the time. Now it takes a lot longer, which is also why I think that the better you become, the longer you must spend on a given project to learn something. If you're a really good programmer, you're not going to learn that much by just starting a brand new project, being with it for a few weeks, and then leaving. And I think that's kind of the dilemma of being in this situation. You can learn a lot from being in different environments, working with different people, but if you leave too soon, you're not going to get the best of it. You're not going to extract the most of it. So I think it's hard to be kind of the nomadic programmer, to be the consultant who's always working on something new. I think that people arrive at that role, usually because they were pretty good at what they do. But once you get to that role, if you don't do something on your own to constantly observe this life cycle of best ever to biggest ball of mud progression, your learning is just going to slow down. Well, the flip side of that is that, well, that's the experts, or whatever, the people who've already been through this a few times, such that their learning isn't that fast. On the flip side is that when you're green, everything turns legacy overnight. And that's the inherent dilemma of coming to a new platform. Because on the one hand, it's very exciting. I've talked to a lot of people who've been, I've been doing PHP, I've been doing .NET, and then I came to Rails, and it was just so great. Everything just kind of fit together, and I understood it so much better. And I feel glad for people who feel that feeling. But I also just feel it's not going to last, buddy. That euphoria you have up front is very soon to be replaced by a crash. And that crash is coming as soon as you realize that your initial perception of what was good Rails code changes 2 days from now. When you've written just 2 days of Rails code, all of a sudden, you dug in deeper and you learned a whole lot of stuff, and what you wrote even just 2 days ago now feels stale. And that's just the inherent dilemma of being new to something, that you get to learn a whole lot really fast, but what you wrote along the way, you don't really like. And I think that that's how a lot of people kind of have a problem coming to Rails. Because whatever they were working on before, they probably reached some plateau. They reached some plateau where they got their stuff done. They got their stuff done at a predictable pace. They kind of knew where they were, and now they're throwing that out and replacing it with an initial burst of euphoria and then a crash. And I think not everybody takes that lightly. But at the same time, my own perception of this is that there's just no other way. There's no other way to consistently learn and become better than to write a whole lot of legacy software. So you better damn well just get used to it now. You'd better get used to the fact that whatever you're writing right now is you're going to change your perceptions of that code base over time. And thus, it kind of becomes not very helpful to just change your environment all the time, or change this piece of technology just for you to be able to wipe the slate clean, because you're not going to get that much out of it, and it's going to happen again. So writing legacy software can feel like it's a waste of time, but I think the only way to avoid legacy software is to stop growing, to stop learning, and you don't want to do that. So I think that for that to sink in on a collective level, we have to change our way of dealing with the term legacy software. I've used it in the past very much as an attribute description. I would stick it on a piece of technology or some code I wrote myself that I just didn't like. And I don't think that's not a helpful definition of legacy. In many ways, I think we should flip it around and try to make legacy sexy. Or at least making cleaning up legacy software sexy, learning from legacy software sexy. I think that's the only way that we're on a collective basis is going to just accept it. And if we don't accept it, I think it's just going to lead to misery and pain. Because I think most people, most of the time, will be working in systems that aren't, at that point in time, representative of the best that they could do. You're always working with legacy software. So if you don't change your perception about it, if you don't turn it sexy, I think you're just setting yourself up for a life of misery. And who wants to do that? We're in all of this. We were excited about Ruby on Rails and all of these things to make our lives better, to be happier about what we work on. And I think all that is about how do we feel about legacy software? How do we as programmers approach it and so on? Well, there's another side to that. There's a flip side to that. And Joel Spolsky has this interesting notion that good software takes 10 years to write. I think that definition of good is perhaps not as helpful as just saying truly successful software takes 10 years to write. Or if it doesn't take 10 years to write, it takes good software 10 years to become truly successful. So if you want to be involved with anything that has a lasting impact, you're going to be working with a given code base for a long time. If not 10 years, then for many years. And I think that's where it's most interesting for me. It's most interesting for me to work on software that has an impact. That's why I'm still working with Ruby on Rails 5 years on, because the impact it's having now, in many ways, is even greater than the impact it was having in the beginning, when everything was fresh and I was thinking best code ever about everything we were working on. We've replaced that best code ever by thinking, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that sucks. There's a lot of stuff that we want to rewrite. I feel that way about Rails. I feel that way about Basecamp. But I've turned it around and thought, this is where we're getting the most out of it. Basecamp, the project or product I'm working at 37signals, now is the time where it's having the most impact. Now is the time where it's reaching the most amount of people. So now is when I should be most engaged in it, not the least engaged. And I think that's where that whole new shiny object, or trying to escape legacy software, constantly rewriting, constantly fleeing that perceived prison, is really a bad approach, because it robs you from being part of that greater notion of creating something that has a truly sustainable and pronounced impact on the world. And if we're not having a truly and sustainable and pronounced impact on the world, what are we doing? It's a waste of time. So I think the goal for everybody should be to be involved with software that can take 10 years to write and to be happy about it. Because the alternative to that, to follow just the regular life cycle of things, to follow the good tomato to rotten tomato approach, is that it leads to this notion, again a quote from Joe Spolsky, the single worst strategic mistake that any software company can make is rewriting the code from scratch. And I fully believe this. I think it's incompatible with having that sustainable impact that you just stop at some moment in time when you're just starting to get stuff rolling, because that's usually when it happens. You start feeling that the code you're working on is legacy, is kind of crap, just by the time stuff gets rolling. When Basecamp was, I think, about 3 years old, Basecamp was the very first project I wrote in Ruby, along with Rails. So obviously, I learned so much over those 3 years. And thus, Basecamp in so many ways felt so incredibly legacy to me. This was my learning project in Ruby. That we very often had that instinctual reaction that this is really just tying me down. I'm not moving forward here. We got to rewrite. But I think this is where the writings of Joe Spolsky and others who talking about first of all, the second system syndrome and all of these negative effects of rewriting just somehow prevailed, and I'm so much happier for it, because I got to watch that process from really being learning project code to being code that drives a company like 37signals. Basecamp is still by very far our biggest product, and if we had just stopped for a year just to rewrite it for the rewrite's sake, what would we have gotten out of it? We would have wiped the slate clean once, then another 2 years would have gone by, and again we would have grown into feeling this is just legacy. We got to rewrite again. So I think stop thinking that you can just rewrite your way out of legacy. If you have an application that you don't, that's feeling legacy to you right now, just realize that you just have to change that step by step. Just erasing everything and starting over, is not going to teach you all that much, and it's going to happen again. Okay. So, 37signals has, by definition, the oldest Ruby on Rails code base of anyone. A lot of the code, or substantial amount of the code, is from 2003. It's 5 years old. And as we were talking about, that's an eternity when you're learning and evolving and so on. And I think in many ways that even came from the best of circumstances. I got to create most of the code base by myself. So I got to infuse that single-person sense of vision or direction or whatever you want to call it into it. But still, tons of the 37signals code base has turned legacy. And we've just come to terms to deal with that. And I want to take a little time to look at some of that stuff, look at some of that actual legacy code that's active right now and driving the applications that we have, and reflect on some of those specifics. What are the elements of the code that we have right now that I'm feeling is contributing to this sense of legacy that I feel about the code base that we have. And I think one of the overarching notions in examining that, for me, is a parallel to the broken windows theory, which is the theory that when everything is in working order, when everything is nice, it'll stay nice. As soon as you just have one window that breaks, that you don't fix, things will start accumulating. More windows will break that you won't fix. Trash will accumulate. All of this stuff kind of starts from one point where you just get this snowball effect, acceleration of it was great and it was crap. And that usually have that one pivotal point. I think the point where it doesn't relate as well to code is that often we don't notice that broken window. We don't notice when it happens. We aren't seeing that inflection point, because if we were, we would probably just fix it. The problem is we can't see it in any way other than in retrospect. By the time it's already done, some substantial amount of impact on it. Anyway, the first kind of notion for me, the first inflection point that I'm often looking at when I'm feeling legacy about our code base is this notion of the garbage cans. The what a mess feeling about a certain part of the code. And let's actually look at some of that messy code. So the first part of messy code is going to be from Basecamp. Basecamp is, of course, the oldest project that we have. Now, this is the application helper that we have in Basecamp. And you can notice one thing if you look over to the left, that number on the right, this is kind of long, like 500 lines of code. And what do these things have to do with each other? Page footer, display flash, looking at project. How much coherence is really going on right here? Not a whole lot, right? Like, these things don't relate to each other in a meaningful way, other than the fact that this was an easy place to put them. And I think that's where that broken window, the thing I realized after that I saw this turned into a trash can, that we just threw everything we could into the application helper, and we kind of look back at that. Why was that? What was that broken window that kicked this off? Why would we let this go? How did application helper come to be a 500-line module? And I realized that that's how, or one example of how that legacy stuff is coming in, is the inflection point for this is usually something very specific. The inflection point for having a huge application helper was this, or rather the lack of this. Before we had this notion of helper all, of just including all the helpers for all controllers to use, you had to be explicit about it. So if you wanted, let's say, display flash to be available in 3 controllers and their views, you would have to explicitly create a module for display flash and include it in all of these 3 controllers. And what if you needed it in another control? Then you would have to add it there. What if you had it in a partial that was included in other controllers again? That wouldn't work. It wasn't going to work if you were going to be explicit about it like this. So we came up with this broken window, the application helper, to get us out of that. What if we just have one module that's included everywhere? Then we can kind of get around it, right? Then display flash is just going to be available everywhere. Well, of course, that was the inflection point. That was when we set ourselves up to create a huge trash can, because application helper was blessed specifically to be the only one that could do that. So if we wanted that convenience of having a different method available wherever we wanted it to be, we had to put crap into application helper. And so we did. But now that we have this notion of helper all, that all helpers are available to all controllers at all times, we don't need this anymore. But when this came in, most of the time, you don't go back to revisit. And that's how these things start piling up. The window was broken once. We might have fixed that one broken window, but all the trash that was left from it is still around. So let's take this example. How would we clean this up? What would we do? Well, I would start looking for things that kind of fit together. So we're looking at page header, page footer. Well, let's make another module for that. Of course, we would extract it into its own file. Let's call it layout helper. So we can get like this stuff in here, page header, page footer. What else is there? Whoop. Private header, sheet, page header. That sounds like it fits together. Full width. Asking about the full width. Well, that's also kind of a layout concern. Let's put that up there. So now we structured it a little bit. We started chipping away of it because we realized what was the inflection point. And this is where we learned something. This is where we learned that it's not just about its legacy software. It was a specific point that let this particular thing to get away from us in a way where we didn't like it anymore. And we can do this specific thing to fix it. And this is something we learn when we stay with the code base for a long time. Otherwise, this would kind of just be implicit, and we wouldn't be learning from it what is the pattern, what is the, in my mind here, the pattern or the category is that notion of garbage can. Now, I've developed that notion that, okay, these garbage cans can kind of appear when these factors are in play. When I'm setting myself up to promote a single place to be included everywhere because it has that kind of convenience that I need a method everywhere, I just put it in one place and then it goes everywhere. I'm setting myself up for garbage cans. So that's a higher level extraction. That's a higher level piece of knowledge I can take out of this specific incident and start doing something to it. So we got layout helper. What else could we kind of work on here? We got some things that sound like they're about the browser. So we could make another module here, browser tricks helper. That would kind of deal with the style sheet that has to be specific for IE, another thing for IE, and the force healthy hover, which is actually a method that deals with a rendering bug in Safari. So again, chipped away at it slowly. When we do it like this, we're taking the option, we're saying, well, I'm not just going to give up. I'm not just going to say this is the lost cause. This is horrible. I'm just going to pour more into the garbage can until I get to that inflection point where I just can't take it anymore. We're trying to go back, trying to walk back down through that branch and just take it one step back. Just saying, okay, this could be better. Let's get it back to this could be better. Let's just extract 5 helpers from here and bring back application helper to 200 lines. We don't even have to necessarily at all times feel that we need to clean up everything. And I think that's part of the problem with the whole legacy term too, is that you kind of feel like often it's all or nothing. Or you can't perceive the small changes, what that impact will have before you start trying that. So it gets to be about the extremes. It gets to be either it's like that crap, I can't do anything about it, gotta rewrite from scratch, or it's that best code. There's a lot of gray in between there. And you can just, if you just get it a little bit down, if we just cleaned this up a little bit, if I just extracted these 2 helpers alone, I would already start feeling, well, this is kind of better. I'm already on a good path. And I think that's part of the secret to living with legacy software, is that you can't solve all your legacy decisions in one fell swoop. You have to do them step by step. And I think one of the techniques that we've been using is you have to leave the code you touch in a better condition than you found it. And the way that works is that you're probably or presumably always working on enhancing your application, adding new features, fixing bugs. And through that quest, you're slowly going to touch all parts of the code base. So if your approach to living with legacy software is that you're just slowly going to clean these things up as you encounter them, it gets to be a lot more joyful. And you get to narrow the scope down to just a few things. All right, so that's application helper. So this is one specific thing you can take from this. If your application helper is large, and by large, probably 100 lines or more, application helper really is supposed to be empty. That's my idea of this. Application holder is a staging point. Application holder is where you put something you don't quite know where it should go. Or you just have that one exception that you don't quite know where to put it. You can put it in the application helper, just like you can put something in lib before you turn it into a plugin. But you got to treat it as though it's a train station. People are supposed to leave. They're not supposed to just stick around in their sleeping bags forever. They start smelling. So that's application helper. Well, we could try to do the same thing, because now we have that notion, we have that pattern, we have the frame of mind of the garbage can. So let's look at another object we have here. Person. So this is the person object, or the user object in Basecamp, and it has a lot of stuff in it. So it has some interesting things too that are just where you can see that the Basecamp code base is kind of old. We used to have a way of implementing these hooks, these before save hooks, as just methods you would overwrite. And you can see why that was a bad idea. When we just look at this, you can't see what's going on. So it does something before save, so it does something before destroy, so it does something before validation. How am I really getting any smarter from looking at this project? You have to dig into the individual code lines. Where today, of course, we would do something like before, what was it? Before save, we would do set token. So from this, the implementation of token could still be concealed, which would be fine, but the purpose of why we're doing a hook would be exposed when you're just looking at the object. So that's another one of those things where legacy often comes from just you got slightly better tools and you just didn't update it to do it. Here we should have done that. Anyway, that wasn't what I wanted to show. What I wanted to show is that the person object, just like the application helper, kind of grows over time when you add stuff that the person should be able to do, but isn't necessarily core to what the person object is. One example of that is this notion of, up here we have has one configuration. All right, so there's some notion of person configuration. Even from just looking at that, it doesn't reveal very much. It doesn't reveal what is this configuration, what could be in this configuration. Well, it turns out this configuration, as of right now, is only used for one thing. It's used to track whether the user has seen a system notice and whether he has dismissed it or not yet. That's very different from just saying, well, we have a general purpose configuration object. And really, is whether the user has seen a system notice a fundamental or essential attribute of the user itself? I don't really think so. So this is one of those things where we can go sniffing out things that doesn't need to be in person, kind of picking stuff out of the garbage can and sorting our trash better. So what I would do in this instance is something new we started to do at 37signals, the more we've kind of discovered these garbage cans in the model space, which is to turn this in to what I like to call a concern. So this is something that we want the person object to still be able to do. We still, the notion of whether the person has seen a system or notice or not is still something the person needs to do. So it's not something we can just delete. It's still functionality that we need. But at the same time, it's not really something that we want to honor enough to turn it into its own object and give it its own hierarchy and all that stuff. So one kind of in between of just putting stuff into person RB and in between creating a big object for this itself and building a big hierarchy is just a notion of a concern. So for us, a concern is just a module, basically. So what we'll do is that first we'll create a person folder. This will hold all the concerns that we extract from the person. And after that, we'll add this concern, and we can just call it system notice. So we're picking stuff out of the garbage can here. Well, we could even, system notice, fine. So now we have a module for system notice. We can take this stuff, grab it out there, stick it into the system notice, grab the configuration here, stick that into the system notice too. We actually kind of got to do a self included in user and add that to the user. User has one configuration. The cool thing about this is now we got a ton of, and we're going to include it here too. And just to make it all right, we're going to do system notice. All right, so this is exactly the same thing. When you're working with the person object, nothing changed. But something changed about your feelings about person object. It's now slightly cleaner. And the cool thing about this is, too, we took a lot of things that were kind of spread out. So it was a definition of an association that by itself didn't reveal very much. What was this configuration about? We put it together with what's actually being used, and we encapsulated it in something that reveals its intention. So now we actually also have an obvious spot of documenting all of this stuff that kind of fits together, but aren't explained by its own individual part. System notices are tracked per user and can be turned off per user. So this kind of explains why we need this module. And we're using a technique here that's often being used when you feel like you want to reuse something. Well, concerns are not about reuse. They're about comprehension and cohesion. So we're taking this technique that we extracted from the notion of the garbage can theory, and we're using it specifically just to increase the coherence of the person object. Now it has less lines of code. We just extracted 21 lines of code. If we do that a few more times and extract a few more of those non-essential ideas from the person object, we'll probably arrive at something that's pretty usable. And as you can see here, we've actually done that a few times already. So if you take a look at identifiable, that's a lib we added, which is just for tracking UUID on that user. Again, UUID or ID and how you create that is not integral to what a user is. But it's kind of nice. It's kind of nice that we can just add it in like this. So here it's being used for something reusable, but system notice is not something reusable. And the technique can kind of be used for both ends of it. So that's the person that's dealing with another garbage can. Here is definitely also, I just want to give you a quick show of something that's really feeling legacy to me. And this is actually all live code. This is the code we run for Basecamp. So this is not just something I've picked out of the archives. We have a controller that's called the global controller. I love that name. There couldn't be any other name that revealed less about what it does than the global controller. It's almost as good as the application helper. Yeah, it helps the application. And this kind of does global stuff. It's almost like having methods that say do stuff. So that itself is just one of those things that I look back at and laugh that I actually was serious when I wrote this at one point. But as you can see, what does the global controller do? Well, it does global stuff. It controls the appearance. You can set up your chat. There's categories. There's settings. You can even get your invoices. It does pretty much everything that I couldn't figure out how to stuff in somewhere else. So this is truly one of those archetypes of trash cans. And what was the point that led to that? Why did we let something like global controller arrive? Well, just like in the helper case, we didn't have helper all. And in the person case, before I had this notion of just treating modules as concerns as something you can extract that's not just for reuse. Well, this case, before we had REST, there wasn't really a natural boundary of when is a controller too fat? When is it doing too much stuff? So global controller probably started out being somewhat reasonable. It probably did stuff like account and invoice and another thing that related to admin functions. But there wasn't any natural stopgap. So the window was already broken, and now crap just filed in. Well, this is, of course, an example where we can all look at it and laugh now that this makes no sense. This controller should be probably 7 different smaller controllers that all just control their own little specific things that actually did something. Anyway, I thought that was just kind of funny. One aspect, just one example of seeing like how this kind of worked already, and where we used it to good effect, is if you look at the environment RB for Basecamp, that used to be a true horror show of global controller proportions. It used to have everything that just in some ways had to be configured. Well, look at it now. It's pretty clean. It's 40 lines of code, and it's really easily readable. How did it get to that point? Well, we realized, of course, a while back that the config itself, just having that in one file, really just doesn't encapsulate what we should do. So we came up with this notion of initializers. Initializers, all of this stuff, admin, this, that, and the other thing, used to just be stuffed into environment RB. And this is just another example of saying, when you've been through that process of watching your application turn legacy, when you're starting to watch and discover those patterns, the trash can syndrome, for example, these notions are something you can recognize all over your code base now. Like, here are 4 different examples of we now have a tool set to deal with all of that stuff, to dial back the clock on the degradation of our application into legacy. All right. So what did I get out of being able to watch these trash can scrolls? I got that notion of extracting concerns, from the application helper, from anything sounding global, treating anything global as a train station where stuff is supposed to leave as soon as I find out what it kind of really belongs to. Another example on kind of the other side of that is dry. Often you have good intentions that lead you astray, or you have good intentions or good patterns that just doesn't encapsulate all that you want to do or all that you're working with. And I think dry is definitely one of those things where when you first learn of a new idea, you kind of embrace it as much as you can. Let's make everything as dry as we possibly can, no repetition anywhere. And then as you work with it for a while, you realize that it's definitely possible to go overboard. And one of those instances for me with dry is that once I've made a system completely dry, there's no repetition of anything anywhere, everything has its place, it can be kind of hard to fit new stuff in. And I usually get this as, I just want to change one thing. I don't want to change my entire architecture of how all this works. And when your system is too dry, oftentimes that can be kind of hard. You abstracted this all the way out. You made this as clean as you possibly could, but it made it sort of hostile to changes. I have another example of that. So in Highrise, which is another application we have at 37signals, we have this notion of recordings. The recordings are emails and notes and whatever else you have about a given person that we structure into these silos. So already so we have here a helper method that's called render recordings. We can see where's that going. All right, that's going into the recording helper, which again is calling another render call, which is a partial. And I mean, already here we got one of those things I used to like, but I don't really like anymore. Encapsulating specific render calls and helpers, I've kind of turned sour on that because to me, it makes it very easy to miss the flow of how the view is bound together. When you're jumping back and forth between helper and view to just track how the different partials fit together, that's something that, for me, very often leads to kind of that confused feeling of, how does this partial fit in here again? How do I get to this just one thing I want to change? Anyway, so recording helper calls another partial here, the index HTML. And here we have another pattern that I'm now starting to feel legacy. This is, again, one of those things. We thought we had a good idea. So we came up with this idea. You can see index.rhtml live in the same. That's the original template that's called directly. And then we have a partial that's called underscore index HTML RB, kind of living in the same space, because that would be the index of all the recordings, just encapsulating their own partial. Thought that was kind of clever. You would have like your partials of index and show and so on. But it turned out to just be kind of a mess because that underscore in itself is not significant enough to you to realize the differences between the two files. So another example of just we thought we had a great idea, and that's the problem often with legacy, that the concoctions you come up with to deal with it are often worse than the disease, and you can't realize that until further down the line. But here we have another render call, which is again kind of a messy thing. It renders a partial, and that partial is determined on which recording template you want, how you want your recordings shown. Do you want them in less format, or do you want them all expanded, or whatever? Anyway, the important part is this guy. Show in list. I mean, just looking at it, something's not right here. And what is actually not right? For me, it took a while to realize that, but I realized that it wasn't right because the original version of it was very dry. It was a lot shorter than this. And then I needed to change just one more thing. We got this new notion of task recordings that we got to put in there, which task recordings are kind of recordings, but not really. They have like their own special ways they want to be displayed, and this is often how it begins. You have this dry notion of this super class that fits pretty nicely to like the 3 subclasses you have, and then you get a 4th subclass, which is almost like the others, but not quite. And this is how all those changes creep in, and something that used to be so lovely and dry no longer is. This is definitely one of those cases. So what would we do here to kind of clean that up? Well, I would kind of start out with the notion that, no. Maybe stuff doesn't need to be, God damn it. Man, this is a game. I think, all right. Fooled you. So this is a notion of how do we deal with this problem? How do we deal with something that used to be so lovely and dry? And we kind of still feel that it's dry. It's all in one place. But now the dryness has all of these nasty exceptions. Well, for me, the first step is to start with just duplication. So what I'm noticing here is we got an if this is a task recording. We have a lot of other things that kind of relate to the task recording. If we just take all of this stuff and kind of clone it into task recordings, we'll have a new file in here that just is task in list. So now we've extracted that, and we're going to cut this down just to be about the task recording. Take this out, take all this else out. This is the it's a lot harder to do in the screen. So here we have another thing. There's an if, and it's again, if it's a task recorder, we don't need it. We can take this out, unless it's a task recording. Well, it is a task recording, so we can take that out, take this out. And we can kind of walk through all of this. Whoop, we don't need that one either. And it's definitely not going to be an email, because it's a task recording. Take this out. Well, it is a task recording, so we can simplify this greatly. So as you see, as I'm going through this, the file is getting simpler and simpler and simpler because I'm taking out all of these exceptions. But it's also going to have some duplication of this other file, this generic version of it. That's okay. Sometimes things doesn't need to be as dry as you think they should be. Sometimes just having a little bit of duplication just makes sure the fabric of your software more flexible and something that you can more easily change. So this is an example of where we arrived at dry because we had too much duplication. We probably had this in 5 examples, and when we needed to change just the heading, everything needed to change again. So we went overboard, and we made everything too dry. We thought, now we had that best software ever. Then we learned a little bit more, that if you make things too dry, they can kind of become inflexible, and they don't stretch very well. So we backed off that again. And I think that's just that natural cycle of where if you get too attached to what you know right now and get so attached that you've got to bring everything up to current standards of how it is right now, the best that you know, you can't have any part of your software that doesn't fulfill that, you're just setting yourself up for doing that again very shortly again. Because realize that wherever you are in your kind of journey of becoming a better programmer, hopefully you'll always kind of change what you think is right. You'll always evolve that. So there's never that one point in time where you can just wipe the slate clean and everything can be perfect. A little repetition is okay in that specific instant. And a little legacy ain't so bad. Because I think it reminds you at all times that what you're doing is never going to be perfect. So having an application that's constantly in some state of legacy keeps you honest. It keeps you honest about yourself and how you're growing as a programmer, and honest about whatever I'm coming up with right now. However smart I think I am in this instant, I'm probably going to think that I'm even smarter tomorrow. So don't get too invested in it. All right? Thanks very much.